Turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. As I have mentioned before, we are almost to the end of Mark. I wondered how a year-long series on a book would go, and I think it's gone fairly well. I haven't gotten tired of it yet. So you may have gotten tired of it, but I did not get tired of it, so I am thankful for that. But one thing I did want to touch on is Mark chapter 13, and I don't have a PowerPoint for tonight, so you'll just have to use your imagination about whatever things you think would be back there. We covered Mark 13 last Sunday morning, and there may be some more questions that are concerning it, and so I'm just going to talk about a few different things, and then if you have questions along with that, then please let me know, and we will try to address as many of those as possible. So a couple things just leading into it. So here in Mark chapter 13, remember the context of what is going on is Jesus is sitting with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And the way you can ask people that know like Jerusalem better than I do, but the way I understand it is this Mount of Olives can kind of like overlook Jerusalem and the Temple Mound area and where the temple complex was and all of that stuff. And so this is right after we have them basically talking about the temple, about how beautiful it was, about these great buildings. We know from history about the large stones that were used, and it was just an amazing place. And Jesus is now sitting with them and talking to them because he's made this statement there in verse 2. Mark 13 and verse 2. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And then we get verses 3 and 4, and while they are looking at all these things, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew ask him privately, tell us when these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled. They are at least asking two questions, at least in Mark's account. The first question is a question about time, when something is going to happen. And the second question is about sign. How will we know when it is going to happen? Okay? And so that is the two things that he is answering. If you go to, we'll just go there. Go to Matthew chapter 24. And one thing I've tried to do when we're doing our Mark series is I've tried to stay in Mark as much as possible. But in Matthew in chapter 24, we have a Matthew's account of this. And in verse 3, we actually have three questions. Tell us when, there's the time question, when these things will be. What will be the sign of your coming? That's the sign question. And of the end of the age. So there's a third question about when is going to be the end of the age. And so when you look at Mark chapter 13, it seems to be that Jesus is answering, first of all, the when. He's answering what is going to be the sign. And then thirdly, he answers about the end of the world. Okay? So that's kind of how I break down Mark chapter 13. Something else I want to be very, very clear about is I don't understand all of this. Okay? I don't know if anybody that tells you they understand all of this, they probably don't understand all of this. And so there's some questions that I struggle with that I just try to do my best. But from my understanding, those are the three questions that are going to be asked. So before we jump into him answering the first question, is there any questions or comments or need further explanation even on our starting off? Yes, ma'am.
So why did the temple need to be destroyed in the first place?
Why did the temple what? Very good question. So why did the temple need to be destroyed in the first place? very early on, let's go back to Mark chapter 2, and I want to show you a little bit of more context. Very early on, many things that Jesus was doing was showing that the temple had lost its way. It was no longer going to be what it was going to be. In fact, in Mark chapter 2, you have the story of the man being let down by the paralytic man being let down by his 4 friends, right? And remember, the big point that is being made here is that Jesus has the power to do what? Not just heal, but to forgive sins, okay? That was the problem. That's what the people were upset about. Verse 6, and some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? Which we realize that is true, right? Only God can forgive sins, and what Jesus is making is a God claim that He is God. Now think also in the idea of Judaism, not only can only God forgive sins, but where does the forgiveness of sins take place? Not in the synagogue, in the temple. Because what happens at the temple? Sacrifices. So already early on in His ministry, Jesus is showing that there's going to be a different way. And He is starting to fulfill all of those things of Judaism. So once you start to layer all the gospel accounts on top of themselves, what you find is that Jesus is replacing the temple because He is now the temple. Jesus is replacing the sacrifices because He is now the sacrifice. Jesus is replacing the priesthood because He is now the priesthood. No longer does a worshiper have to come to the temple in order to be saved. You just have to come to the temple, being Jesus, in order to be saved. And so to get back to why did the temple have to be destroyed is because when there is no temple, there is no Judaism. Without the temple, you have a form of Judaism. We have this rabbinical Judaism that is still around today, but it's not Judaism according to the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, you had to have the temple. And what we have in this destruction of the temple is not just Rome destroying the temple, but who else destroying the temple? It is God Himself destroying the temple. He is putting away these things, okay? And that opens up the idea that there is a new temple. And this was always part of the plan, okay? It's not like this was a plan B type thing. This was always part of the plan that God was going to make a new covenant with His people. And you can find passage after passage in the Old Testament that looks to this New Testament reality of this temple being destroyed. So, back to answer the question more directly, the temple had to be destroyed because Judaism was no longer going to be around. And so, where there's no Judaism, there's no temple. Where there's no temple, there's no Judaism. Questions or comments about that? Did I help answer your question? Okay. Yes, Cisco.
I know this is kind of hard because a lot of people don't understand this, but somewhere in the Bible He has to mention somehow which generation will see some signs like you're asking.
Right.
Like He's asking. So a generation, you have to figure out which generation He talks about because of Israel, which it's in the Bible that God loves Israel passionately, and it came to alive again 2 times. The second time it came alive, that's when the whole nation can finally recognize who Israel is, and He's bringing everybody back together.
Okay.
So you have to ask yourself a question. In what generation will see all the signs when He's coming back? Because He talks to us in the Bible of different signs. So either we're not looking, you have to look at the signs that happens today in the world today, which is happening happening around the world today. So the signs are there, but a lot of people don't understand or just don't want to accept it.
Okay, so along those lines, let's look at that and try to answer the when question, okay? I think it's very important, and Cisco is bringing up some of the things that perhaps we need to address in this, okay? So, and I'm just going to try to do a little bit of like a running commentary as I go along. So starting in verse 5, and Jesus answering them, okay, so he's going to be answering the questions that have been asked, began to say, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will deceive many. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not near. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. Now, some commentators look at this and say that it's not necessarily talking about earthquakes as far as the earth shaking, but talking about what happens when armies come in. You have the cavalry and you have the infantry, and actually shaking the earth, the amount of people that are coming in. The same thing is true about the famines, because of siege warfare, that people are starving and famines and such. And definitely there will be troubles. But his point he is trying to make is, do not be deceived by these things. But these things are going to happen. But this is not a sign of the end, nor is this the sign of the end of Jerusalem, but this is the beginning. Now let's also remember, what is this first question that he is answering? When shall these things be? What are these things that we are referring to? The temple being destroyed. Why do you say that?
Because that was the context of the question originally. That these stones aren't going to be standing anymore.
Exactly. So he says in verse 2, not one of these stones is going to be on top of each other. There in verse 3, they start asking the question, tell us, when will these things be? What things? When these stones are not going to be on top of each other. Don't try to make Jesus answer a question that he isn't being asked. Okay? He is not being asked in verses 5 through whatever here. He is not being asked, when is the end of the world? And when will I know it's going to be the end of the world? He is being asked, when is it going to happen when these stones are no longer going to be on top of each other? Now, when he says these stones are no longer going to be on top of each other, what is he saying? It's going to be destroyed, right? It's going to be torn down. He doesn't necessarily have to say destroyed. If I say that these walls here, there will come a time when you'll not see one stone on top of one another, you can understand by that I'm talking about destruction of this building. And that's what he's talking about there, okay? Verse 9, but watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for testimony to them, and the gospel must be first preached to all nations. So here he is telling us about all the things that are going to take place before the destruction of the temple. They're going to be thrown into the councils, being the Sanhedrin. They'll be beaten in the synagogues. You can do a lot of reading about Second Temple Judaism and the place of the synagogue. If you read, like, for instance, John chapter 9, where you have the man born blind. Remember, one of the big features of that story is that the parents were afraid to speak up because they were afraid they'd be thrown out of what? The synagogue. Okay? And so there's some of this idea here. The gospel must be first preached to all the nations. The gospel has been preached to all the nations, okay? When we read over in Acts chapter 1 and in verse 8 and basically the outline of how Acts is going to work, how it's going to be in Judea, in Samaria, and then to the ends of the world. And also remember that all nations is referring to the Gentiles also, okay? So the gospel was not just for the Jews, right? We even sing the song, the blessed gospel is for all. The gospel is for all, right? And so he, when you say all nations, the Goya, the Gentiles, is going to be preached to them too. Verse 11, but when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, but whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. It is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit, okay? So again, in context, is he talking to all Christians here? No, he's talking to Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and the greater apostles, if you will. And so this is referring to that they will be inspired by the Holy Spirit and to be able to speak what they need to speak. We find that happening with Paul. We find that happening with Peter and John and the other apostles in Acts chapter 3, where they pray for that boldness and they know what to speak in all of those things. Verse 12, now brother will betray brother to death, and the children, and the father his child, and the children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. We need to realize that in context, Mark 13:13 is not talking about heaven salvation. It is talking about their physical salvation, as far as that if you continue to follow along with me, that you will be able to endure to the end and be saved. So don't try to, it makes it sound like, oh yeah, that sounds just like Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, remain faithful unto death and you will receive a crown of life. But in context, we're talking about the destruction of the temple and what's going to happen to those Jews there. Okay? Verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing where it ought not be, let the reader understand. This is one of those things that I find so ironic, because it says, let the reader understand, and here I am reading it and I don't know what he's talking about. Okay? So how am I supposed to understand this? Well, I think the best way to understand it is to look over in Luke and in chapter 21. Luke in chapter 21. This is trying to let the Bible interpret the Bible for us. And look in Luke 21 and in verse 20. Okay, so starting in Luke 21 and verse 5, we're basically in the same exact context as Mark chapter 13. And there he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. It seems to be, the way that Luke understands it and the way he is reporting it, that the abomination of desolation is when the armies are surrounding Jerusalem. How that works completely, I'm not sure. Maybe it's an abomination of desolation because the abomination being the standards that they would hold up. That was thought to be idol worship and such. And that's the whole reason why there's a whole other thing that took place, that the Jews did not want the Romans to have their standards and their flags and their banners inside Jerusalem, inside the temple, because they saw it as being graven images and idol worship and the like. Maybe that's what the case is, but what Luke is trying to tell us is that when you see these armies surrounding you, that's when you know the end is near. Now, what end? The end of the world? No, the end of Jerusalem. Okay, jump back to Mark 13. So when you see this happening, you need to know that the end is near. Then he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, remember, in context, which question are we answering? When's the temple going to be destroyed? We're not answering when is the end of the world. When it's the end of the world, I don't care what mountain you find, right? Whether it's Mount Everest or Space Mountain, right? It's not going to matter what mountain you're on. It's the end of the world, okay? So he's talking about something different. Yes, Ron?
Could 20 also be referring to the siege walls that were built around the city of Jerusalem? The Romans came in and built 2 siege walls.
Yep.
Around the entire city. And from some of the reading I've done, if people had left when the siege walls were still being built, which they were letting them come and go at that point in time until they fully enclosed them, they had the opportunity to leave.
It seems to be, even from all of these warnings, why give a warning if there's no possibility of having something come from that warning, right? And so it seems to be that was supposed to be, when those armies started to surround, maybe it's about when the different siege walls were being built and all of that stuff. But when you see these armies start to camp around, according to Luke, that's when you know you need to get out of town, okay? Leave, get out, Flee to the mountains. Him that is on top of the house, don't let him go. Don't go back into the house to gather anything. Kind of reminds you when you were a kid, right? And they were talking about fire safety, right? If the house is on fire, you don't run back into the house to get your stuff, right? You flee. Well, Jerusalem is about to be on fire, if you will. Don't run back into your house. You need to leave. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter. So this is all talking about ways to escape an army that's coming in to destroy Jerusalem. For in those days there will be tribulation. All right. Tribulation means tribulation. Sometimes, because of other doctrines that are floating around out there, we try to make words mean more than words mean. And there's a whole doctrine about premillennial dispensationalism, talking about how that at the end of time that there is going to be this earthly kingdom, there's going to be this tribulation, there's going to be this rapture, and all of those things. Remember, the tribulation that we are referring to here is talking about what? The destruction of Jerusalem. Now, David, why do you think that? Well, because they asked the question, when will these things be, referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Don't make Jesus answer a question that he is not answering here, okay? So this tribulation is the difficulties that are going to happen, and it's going to be so bad, it is characterized as such has not been seen since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor shall it be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. So there will be Christians who are physically saved during this time and will not die because of the Lord's help here, and obviously because the Lord is giving them the warning. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, look, here he is there, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I have told you all these things beforehand. Go real quick over to Acts and in chapter 21. Now I'll show you an example of one of these false Christs, at least a reference there to it. Acts chapter 21 and in verse 37. This is Paul dealing with a Jerusalem mob and the different things that are taking place there, and he starts having this conversation with one of the commanders there. It says, then as Paul was led into the barracks, he said to the commander, may I speak to you? He replied, can you speak Greek? Okay, so Paul is wanting to talk to him, and he realized that he speaks Greek. And the commander says, are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? You can also read accounts by Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, and I believe also in Wars, where he talks about this Egyptian. There was a false prophet known as the Egyptian, a false Messiah that rose up during this time and gathered his followers on the Mount of Olives and told his followers about how that they were going to destroy Jerusalem and overthrow it. The Romans found out about it and they squashed the rebellion, but the Egyptian, this man, was able to escape and he fled out into the wilderness. Okay, so that is what is being referred to here in Acts 21, and you can look at different things of Josephus about that also. But in my understanding, in Mark 13, when it's referring to false prophets and false Christs, perhaps the Egyptian is one of those. All right, now we're getting down to, I got like 12 and a half minutes left. So now let's look at verse 24. But in those days, after that tribulation, what days? The days around the temple being destroyed. That's the days. I know that's the days because that's the question that he's asking, is being asked, and that's the question that he is answering. In those days. But then it has this. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Help me. How is that in those days? Because what does that sound like to you, perhaps? It sounds like the second coming, doesn't it? I mean, if you look at some of the other language of the second coming, like, let's just say 1 Peter, is it 1 Peter? 1 Peter 3, no, 2 Peter 3, we're talking about the day of the Lord there, and things melting with a fervent heat. So, help me out here. Yes, Dale is going to help me. Thank you, Dale.
Yes. It says, but in those days following that distress. It doesn't say how soon it follows that distress.
Okay.
It's a little hard to define exactly where it changes, but it could be at that phrase. It could just be, to God, 1,000 years is as a day.
Okay.
At some point after that distress, after the destruction of Jerusalem, he's going to come back.
So one option is, we'll go with Dale's option, is what we find here in verse 24. In those days, the destruction of Jerusalem is included in the tribulation. Sometime after that will be the coming of the Lord. Okay? That's one option. It's not the option I'm going with, but that's an option. And I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it. I find something better, perhaps. But somebody else help me. Don't be scared just because I shot Dale down. I'm going to shoot you down too. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so during the time of his crucifixion, you have the sun that does turn dark, okay? The veil of the temple is ripped, there's earthquakes and all of those things. Could it be referring to that? Maybe, but at the same time, he does not send his angels to gather his elect from the four winds and from the farthest part of the earth during the crucifixion. So, all right, so we're 0 for 2 so far. Who's up next? I'll shoot you down. All right, Garfield. I love it. Come on, Garfield. Say that again. Acts chapter 2 uses very similar language because Acts chapter 2 is quoting from Joel chapter 2, right? And there it doesn't say the exact words, but it does talk about the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood, the blood moon, right? So that's at least interesting. Okay, here's what I'm going to go with. I'll just cut to the chase. Oh, we got okay. All right, never mind. Billy's going to teach it. Go ahead.
I think this is very familiar judgment language that the Jews are very familiar with in the Old Testament. Anytime a nation was going to be judged, this same language was used.
And look at there. Billy got it right. Right. Good job, Billy. All right. So, if you're talking to somebody, you're going to make sure you use language that is going to be understood by them. Okay? When I worked in South Carolina, we had a Hispanic minister there, Carlos, and there was several times that I would try to be explaining something to him, and I had to catch myself because I would be using language that he did not understand. He understood English, but he didn't understand some of the illustrations that I was using. You have to contextualize what you are saying. If you are going to be talking to Jewish people about the judgment of Jerusalem, then you may want to use language that talks about the judgment of other nations also. So, with that in mind, turn over to Isaiah and in chapter 13. Isaiah and in chapter 13. I'm not going to read the entire chapter, but starting in verse 1, we find out that this is going to be talking about a decree, a prophecy against Babylon. All right? At the time that Isaiah is writing this, Babylon is the top dog. It is hard to imagine that a nation that powerful, with that strong of a military, with that much wealth, with that much greatness, with all of those things, could ever be defeated. But it can be defeated. Okay? Now jump down to starting in verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. Well, I thought the day of the Lord was the end of the world. But you see, to the Jewish mind, a day of the Lord is the day of judgment. When the Lord visits, it's connected to judgment. Okay? Now that's why when we talk about the end of the world, we refer to it as the day of the Lord, because guess what that will be? A day of judgment. But at least in their concept, notice this: cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. That is almost word for word of what Jesus says there in Mark chapter 13. And so in my understanding, and looks like in Billy and my understanding of what takes place here in Mark chapter 13, is he is definitely talking about the coming of the Son of Man in judgment upon Jerusalem. And he's using this apocalyptic language to talk about the sun being darkened and the stars falling out of the heavens and all of those things. And also in connection with that, to the Jewish mind, if Jerusalem is going to be utterly destroyed like that, what must be happening? It's got to be the end of the world. Because how else would that take place? And so they're conflating some of those things. All right, yes, Billy, would you like to correct me?
No, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when Jesus was on trial, he did say, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds."
Right?
And the response was anger.
Yes.
And my assumption is that this is, so he was claiming again divinity.
Correct.
He was saying basically, I'm going to come judge Jerusalem. So am I accurate in that?
You are accurate in that because of also the different language in the book of Daniel referring to the Son of Man. The visions of the Son of Man and such, and like in Daniel, 9 and 10, but so yes, the reason why they were upset about that is he's making another divinity claim, another God claim about himself. And that's the whole reason why they were upset in the first place about a lot of things. Okay? So in my understanding, verses 24 and through 27 of Mark chapter 13 is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, Brent. No, Brent. Who are we going to? Dale. Yes.
Okay, so just to stir the pot one more time.
Okay, stir it.
In the corresponding account in Matthew, chapter 24, this is the context where he says, "But about that day and hour no one knows."
Yes.
Only the Father, not the Son. So is he talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in that context?
Well, there again, what I think is taking place is that there's the conflation between the two events. Okay? So in Matthew 24, where he actually says that is there in verse 29, and then jumping down to verse 36 is when he says, "But the day and hour no one knows," which that falls right in line with the Mark 13 passage, where you have this apocalyptic language, and then you have the parable of the fig tree that is being talked about. So the fig tree, the whole reason for that is that you should be able to know certain things, because by looking at the fig tree, you can know certain things are about to happen. Learn from this parable of fig tree. When you see the branches already becoming tender and putting forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. When you look around Jerusalem and you see the armies surrounding it, you know the end is near. Okay? That's the idea of the parable of the fig tree. But then you jump down to verse 32, and this to me seems like the break. Because he's been telling you, you can know this, you can know this, you can know this. And then he gets to verse 32 and he says, but you don't know this. And so this is where I think he starts answering that third question from Matthew 24 and verse 3 about the end of the world. Now, some people look at this and say, well, he's saying that you can know it, but you just don't know the day and the hour. So you can know the year, but you might not know the day and the hour. That seems stupid to me, okay? But that's what some people say. Well, you can know the year. And remember when we did this sermon last week, all those dates, all those years that people knew when it was going to happen, they didn't know because you can't know. And so then in verse 32, but the day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And that is referring to the end of the world, which you should be ready for that judgment also. And that plays into later teaching in the epistles where Paul very clearly, and Peter, very clearly say that you need to be ready. You don't know when it's going to happen. It's like a thief in the night, right? And the whole point of the thief in the night parable or the thief in the night illustration is the thief does not, hey, 9 o'clock, I'm coming, right? Make sure you have all your stuff laid out for me. I'll take it. No, a thief in the night is a thief in the night. You don't know when it's going to happen. It could happen at any night. Okay, I have 10 seconds on my watch, but I will give you 2 minutes, all right, before we break. Yes, Denzel.
Two things. One, when I talk about the gospel, we preach to all nations. Is that Christians go into all the world and preach the gospel, but does that also include the angel mentioned in Revelation who would be flying over the earth to proclaim the gospel?
So, it talking about being preached to all nations, in my understanding, that has been done. It has been done by the disciples of Matthew 28. It is something that should continue to be done by disciples today to continue to spread the gospel. But as far as thinking about being preached to all nations, don't try to make it say more than it's trying to say. Again, in the Jewish mind, you have Jerusalem, and then you have nations. Okay? All the other people are the nations. When we see the Gentiles who are preached to by Paul, there you see all nations that are being involved. That's where you get the whole thing from Romans chapter 10 and 11 about the new Israel, or the Israel being grafted in, these Gentile believers being grafted into the olive tree and all those things. The gospel is for all. The gospel is for all nations. In my understanding, again, this is just my understanding of it, that has taken place as far as before the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so by the time that the Jerusalem is destroyed, all those things have been fulfilled in some way.
Part two, the reading you did from Isaiah 13
Mm-hmm.
and Mark 15 seem to be repeated also in Revelation 8.
Okay. So, yes, definitely in the book of Revelation, there's all kinds of other apocalyptic language that is being used. But as far as what I think Mark 13 is talking about is that because of what is said. The idea, there's a little bit of that language there in chapter 8 and verse 12. The fourth angel sounded, and the third sun was struck, and the third moon, and a third of the stars, and the third of them were darkened, and so on and so on. Definitely, the book of Revelation is full of these signs and symbols, again, relating to the people in their context. It relates to us in a way, but not in the same way that it relates to them. Okay? Remember, while the Gospels are written for you, they were first written for somebody else. And so some of the things are particularly important for them. You don't have to worry about the destruction of Jerusalem as far as the destruction of the temple anymore. Why? Because it's already happened. Okay? I can't, I'm not going to be concerned about that as far as figuring those things out. Okay? Maybe we answered some questions. Maybe we just caused you to have more questions. And if that's the case, that's okay. Because that's why we have God's Word, to try to figure out answers to those questions. But I am out of time for this portion of tonight. I appreciate your discussion, your back and forth, and all of those things. If you want some good reading, I would read Matthew's account in Matthew 24, and I would also read Luke's account there and try to marry all of those together. But we're about to enter into a time of worship, so let's get our hearts and minds prepared for that as we sing some songs together and pray before God's throne.